for coming. My name's Emily Rose, and I'm the chair of the Board of Library Trustees. And thank you for taking that survey on your way in to learn about this historical treasure, and we'll have another similar one on the way out, so please don't forget to do that. I wanted to mention a couple of things leading up to, I'll just start. In 1890, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts passed a law establishing a free public library commission. This was the first organization of its kind in the nation and was charged with promoting the building of public libraries and coordinating their activities throughout Massachusetts. 5 commissioners were appointed by the governor. One of them was Henry Stedman Nourse. Lancaster had established our free public library 29 years earlier. In the Library Commission's report of 1891, Commissioner Nourse wrote that, quote, "The old town of Lancaster has long boasted a possession of one of the best selected libraries, as well as the largest library in proportion to its population in the Commonwealth." Just a little sample of his style and his pride in this town. 128 years later, the Massachusetts Board of Library Commissioners, as it is now called, awarded a grant to the Thayer Memorial Library to conserve and preserve a remarkable work by Henry Nourse, his annotated version of Marvin's History of Lancaster. The funds for the grant, administered by the commission, came from a federal program called the Institute of Museum and Library Services. This institute is funded when Congress approves the country's budget every year. Thayer Memorial Library Director Joe Muley wrote the application for the grant, which brought some of your federal tax dollars back to Lancaster to preserve and digitize this local treasure. You can access all 4 volumes of Nourse's book online now from the library's homepage if you go to a tab stating Lancaster history. This afternoon, we're fortunate to have Leslie Perrin Wilson to speak to us about Henry and his ambitious project. Leslie is an archivist, bibliographer, and scholar, and has authored many publications. She holds a bachelor's degree in Latin from Wellesley College and 2 master's degrees from Simmons College, a Master of Library Science and a Master of Arts in English. Since 1996, she's been the curator of the William Monroe Special Collections at the Concord Free Library in Concord, Massachusetts. Leslie has deep connections to Lancaster, where she lived for many years. In 1983, Leslie began work as a rare books consultant for Lancaster's library. In December 1984, a new rare books room was dedicated in honor of donor Constance V.R. Dexter, and the first major exhibit of material from the rare book collections was opened. In describing Leslie's contributions to this effort, Director Marge Fisher wrote, "She has inventoried the collection, upgraded the cataloging to include the provenance of each item, implemented an in-house conservation program, written a set of policies for the collection, and last but not least has put together this exhibition," end quote. Leslie has continued to consult for the library over the years, and in 2012 she graciously agreed to direct remounting that exhibit, a general diffusion of knowledge for the library's 150th anniversary. She also edited the new catalog, which some of you may even have, and presented the program kicking off the exhibit that year. Leslie, thank you for being with us today. We're eager to have you tell us about Henry Nourse getting the last word on Lancaster's history.
But not really. Thank you, Emily, for that nice introduction, and thank you, Joe and trustees, for asking me to be here to speak today. As Emily said, I lived in Lancaster for 30 years, and even though I live in Clinton now, I still have a very warm feeling in my heart for this place, this particular place, and the treasures that it holds. So, as Emily mentioned, my subject today is Henry Stedman Nourse's extra illustrated copy of Abijah Marvin's 1879 History of Lancaster. That's a big, a mouthful. This 4-volume set of books is part of the Lancaster collection here at the library. As Emily mentioned, it was recently conserved and imaged at the Northeast Document Conservation Center in Andover through federal funds provided by the Institute of Museum and Library Services and administered by the Massachusetts Board of Library Commissioners. Through this project, it's now fully accessible on the library website. So you can wake up in the middle of the night, you can make yourself a bowl of popcorn, you can pour a cold drink, and you can sit there and scroll through Nourse to your heart's content. You may be thinking that this topic sounds pretty arcane, and I would say that that's probably right. What this set is and what motivated its creation are not immediately self-evident. A fair amount of context is required to understand and to appreciate it, and that's what I aim to provide this afternoon, after which we'll take a hands-on look at the 4 volumes. That's these 4 volumes right here. So these 4 volumes are the result of the sustained interest in local history of 2 men, Abijah Perkins Marvin, that's the dude on the right, or my right, your left, and Henry Stedman Nourse, that's the other dude. But for reasons that we'll explore, they do not in any sense represent a collaboration. There's actually a war of words seething within them. Some of you are probably wondering exactly just what Nourse's extra illustrated Marvin is, so let's start out with the basics. As you probably know, Abijah Marvin's History of the Town of Lancaster from the first settlement to the present time was published by the town in 1879. In and of itself, it's a substantial volume. This is the way the book looked when it was published. 798 pages, including an index, plus beyond that, illustrative plates. This work was one of many Massachusetts town histories published in the 19th century as consciousness of national history grew and citizens of the Commonwealth became increasingly aware of local claims to relevance in relation to the larger history of the country. Marvin's book today is still a used and useful resource. I bet that the staff here uses it on a daily basis to answer reference questions. At some point, not long after Marvin's history was published, based on internal evidence in the extra illustrated set, I'd say that that was as early as 1880, Nourse took a copy of the book and began to extra illustrate it. That is, to add annotations and a quantity of extra material that was not part of the book as published. The added material includes notes and corrections written directly on the printed pages, blank leaves with lengthy manuscript notes and corrections, transcriptions, lists, genealogies, engravings and portraits, photographs, manuscript copies of old maps, plans, clippings, and ephemeral items. So it's not hard to imagine how we got from here to here, because there's a lot of extra stuff that's been added in by Nourse. Nourse continued to gather additional content into the 1890s. Somewhere along the way, he took the single bound volume of Marvin and his added material and had it uniformly bound in 3 volumes with the extra material either tipped in, that's glued in along the edge of whatever's being added to a volume, or bound in, or simply glued to available blank space. To these 3 extra illustrated volumes, he added a 4th titled A Collection of Historical Papers and Memoranda Relating to the History and Geography of Lancaster from its purchase from the Indians to 1880. This supplemental volume consists of transcribed documentary material, both primary and secondary, clippings, printed sermons, ephemera, photographs, maps, and tracings. Nourse noted on a blank leaf in the 4th volume that most of what was contained within it was subsequently printed in his Early Records of Lancaster, which was published in 1884. So the fourth volume was pretty much put together in the early 1880s. All of this together expanded the single volume of Marvin's history into something much more extensive than the original book as published. And because of all the annotations and added material, this copy of Marvin is remarkable. It's unique in the way a manuscript source might be. There's not any other copy of Marvin that's like this 4-volume set. The process of creating something is like this. I think something like this is an odd concept from our 21st century perspective. Why would somebody put in the significant time and effort necessary to compile something like this? Obviously, the investment of resources in such a project reflects above all Nourse's commitment to and knowledge of Lancaster history, as well as his access to people and documentation connected with the subject. That said, other factors also played into its creation. It's useful, for example, to look at the history of the extra illustrated book as a genre. It provides background for a broader understanding of what Henry Stedman Nourse was up to. He didn't invent the process of extra illustration. His extra illustrated Marvin has a place within a tradition that predates it by centuries. And by the way, for anybody who's particularly interested in the history of extra illustration, there's a wonderful source that was published in 2017, published by the Huntington Library in California, called Facing the Text: Extra Illustration, Print Culture, and Society in Britain, 1769 to 1840. The author is Lucy Peltz. It's a very useful source because there's so very little out there that's been published about extra illustration. So to have a catalog like this is really, really valuable. So the extra illustration of printed books had its roots in Europe in the 15th and early 16th centuries, the period when printing from movable type was developed and made its way through Europe. It took early printers a while to perfect the techniques necessary to incorporate illustrations into text at the point of printing. So extra illustration was sometimes employed in this period as a way of illustrating books in the absence of a fully satisfactory technical process. The history of extra illustration in England was the major influence on America's interest in the practice. The earliest known English extra illustrated volumes date from the 17th century in a set known as the Little Gidding Concordance, which was assembled between 1625 and 1642 by a group of women living in an Anglican community at Little Gidding in Cambridgeshire, England. It consists of 15 volumes combining clippings from several copies of the King James or Authorized Version of the Bible, with manuscript annotations and continental engravings. And I do have a photograph taken from Lucy Peltz's book of an opening of the Little Gidding Concordance. And as you can see, it's almost like a scrapbook. You know, there are clippings. Think of the number of King James Bibles destroyed in creating this, right? They're clippings glued to the pages and these illustrations that come from other sources, annotations in hand by the people who compiled it. In relation to the Bible and other religious texts, England had a history of iconoclasm, a judgment of religious images as heretical, and a consequent avoidance of using them in print. So the Little Gidding Concordance was, on one level, a response to this circumstance. More elementally, its compilation provided a vehicle for the devout women who put it together to channel their spirituality through sustained engagement with the subject explored and the materials showcased through the project. In the early part of the 18th century, one English title that held particular appeal as a prospect for extra illustration was The History of the Rebellion and Civil Wars in England by Edward Hyde, the first Earl of Clarendon. It was published between 1702 and 1704. As you can imagine, the book was about a subject of broad general interest in England. A niche market quickly developed for extra illustrated copies of this and other titles related to national and local history, literature, landscape, topography, and natural history. As print publishers and dealers and engravers became aware that it might be worthwhile to cater to the potential market for such products, extra illustration entered its heyday. So what began with the Little Gidding Concordance as a personal means of expressing devotion and knowledge became a more elite pastime and a reflection of affluence, taste, and culture, and also often a commercial rather than a personal project. Extra illustrated books during the late 18th century exuded a snobbish cachet. They were luxury commodities embellished with choice engravings, finely bound with edges gilt. Purchasers might buy extra illustrated texts of some titles ready-made by dealers and their agents. Sometimes printed books were published and sold in loose sheets with an optional set of engravings in a portfolio, which a collector could have bound in or bound separately. And sometimes sets of prints to accompany particular titles were undertaken by subscription. Extra illustration took off big time in the 18th century in England and remained a popular gentlemanly enthusiasm through much of the 19th. By that time, it had long since been divorced from its original practical purpose, that is, getting around the difficulties of combining text and illustration in the printed product. Books were, by the mid-18th century, routinely illustrated as part of the printing process. In the latter part of the century, in fact, many printed volumes were actually dismantled to provide illustrations for extra illustrated books. Some critics expressed disapproval of the destruction involved in this word. Lucy Peltz uses the word biblioclasm in connection with the practice, and that's a great word. I've never seen it used anywhere else. She may have made it up for all I know. It's a good word, though. And also reacted against the extreme preciousness of some specimens of the genre. Simultaneously with its commercialization and its development into a high-end hobby for affluent collectors, in lending itself particularly well to the embellishment of historical, regional, and biographical works and works of natural history, extra illustrated books gained appeal among an audience of antiquarians and specialists interested in relatively obscure subjects. As a product of expertise and a desire to affirm the importance of and demonstrate personal knowledge of a particular topic, the extra illustrated book expressed the passions of the enthusiast and provided scope to build on existing knowledge. But it remained, by its very nature, because of the uniqueness and limited accessibility of the final product, a private rather than a public platform. American collectors began to acquire English extra illustrated books in the late 18th century and soon after to practice extra illustration on their own. As in England, they often specialized in subjects relating to national history. By the late 19th, the period during which Henry Stedman Nourse worked on his enhancement of Marvin, extra illustration had been embraced both as a collecting area by the affluent and as a do-it-yourself pastime by those of an antiquarian inclination. Interestingly, at a time when increasingly efficient methods of book production and of combining text and image were in use, extra illustration was not only out of the mainstream, but also distinctly anachronistic. Lucy Peltz, author of the book on extra illustration, writes of the practice in this period: the concomitant taste for antiquarian book collecting and extra illustration in late 19th century America was a sentimental response to the pace of technological change and a way of coping therapeutically with the modern world. So how does all of this apply to Nourse's extra illustrated Marvin? When you look closely at Nourse's Marvin, you'll see that his motivations in undertaking it varied significantly from the impulses behind that commercial extra illustration boom in late 18th century Britain. Nourse was an antiquarian and a historian, not a collector per se. His was a hands-on project driven by intense personal commitment to Lancaster history. Moreover, there was no commercial inducement in it for him or for anyone else. Nevertheless, even though Nourse's Marvin doesn't radiate the appeal to connoisseurship so typical of many late 18th century English extra illustrated productions, there was an element of elitism in its compilation, a certain pride on Nourse's part in his own superior knowledge of Lancaster history and of the sources documenting it. But the similarity between Nourse's Marvin and English extra illustrated books at their high point of popularity pretty much ends there. In terms of underlying motivation, there's a stronger parallel, I think, to be drawn between Nourse's project and the Little Gidding Concordance. The Concordance was a private effort, not commercial. It grew out of devotion and the impulse to express it in a sustained and focused and personal way. You might well regard Nourse's intense concentration on Lancaster as another form of devotion. In an elemental way, Nourse's work is more reflective of Anglo-American extra illustration in its Little Gidding origins than in its development into a looks product. So you may be wondering, rightly, how knowledgeable Henry Nourse was about extra illustration and its history. And I confess that I can't give you a solid answer to that question. But he was not alone among late 19th century Massachusetts local historians in taking on a project like this. He may have been aware of other similar efforts, and through them of the potential of extra illustration to improve upon factual accuracy and to promote a historical interpretation based firmly on documentation. In the Concord Free Public Library Special Collections, there's a late 19th century example of extra illustration that shares a lot in common with Nourse's Marvin. It's Edward Jarvis's extra illustrated copy of Lemuel Shattuck's 1835 History of Concord, which Jarvis assembled in the 1870s. And it too reflects its compiler's concern with precision and detail. We don't know that projects like Jarvis's were on Nourse's radar screen. Suffice it to say that whatever exposure he may have had to the history of extra illustration or its practice in his own time, it's obvious from his enhanced Marvin that he understood how to exploit the capabilities of the process. So let's take a closer look now at the two key players in this story, beginning with Nourse. So as you likely know, or know some of it anyway, Henry Stedman Nourse was born in Lancaster in 1831 to carpenter Stedman Nourse and his wife Patty, or Martha Patty Howard Nourse, and he died here in 1903. Nourse had Mayflower ancestry. He was a descendant through his mother of John Alden. Rebecca Nourse, or Nurse, who was infamously executed as a witch in Salem in 1692, was a predecessor on his father's side. Ancestors on both sides of the family served in the American War of Independence. The intertwining of his family history with significant events in regional and national history likely encouraged his inclination as a historian to see the importance of the local in the story of the nation. Nourse attended school here and in 1849 went on to Harvard College, graduating in 1853. He taught in Lancaster during winters to meet college expenses. That was what young men did in those days. After graduation, he taught for 2 years at Phillips Exeter. He was professor of ancient languages there, and then became principal of Bristol Academy in Taunton. Nourse left teaching to become a civil engineer. In 1858, he went to work in Boston for Whitwell and Hank, an engineering company involved in filling in the Back Bay. And in 1859 and 1860, worked in Maryland for the Delaware Railway. At the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, he joined the 55th Illinois Infantry and served until 1865, mustering out as a captain. He saw a great deal of active fighting and took part in Sherman's March to the Sea in 1864. After the war, he went back to engineering, first in Maryland, then in Pennsylvania. In 1866, he was appointed by the Pennsylvania Steel Company to undertake the construction of the Bessemer Steel Works near Harrisburg, and in 1868 became superintendent there. In 1870, Nourse married Lancaster war widow Mary Baldwin Whitney Thurston. He resigned from his position at Bessemer at the beginning of 1874, and the couple took an extended trip abroad, and on returning to this country, made their home in Lancaster. Once permanently resettled here, Nourse threw his energy into public service and historical research. He was a Massachusetts representative in 1883 and a state senator in 1885 and 1886, chairing committees on roads and bridges, labor, and public service. He was appointed a trustee of the Worcester Insane Hospital in 1888, a member of the state's Free Library Commission in 1890, and a member of the Board of Lunacy and Charity in 1898. He also held public office in Lancaster, notably, as Emily mentioned, as a library trustee for a quarter of a century here, beginning in 1878. So retirement from paid employment allowed Nourse to pursue his interest in local history. In approaching research, he was focused and fastidious. He also had enormous respect for primary material, including the town records. He compiled primary documentation relating to 16th and 17th century Lancaster in the volume, The Early Records of Lancaster, which was published in 1884, to bring together the scattered and sketchy local documentation up to 1725. Published in 1889, his Military Annals of Lancaster contain military records of the town from 1740 to 1865. He also edited the Birth, Marriage, and Death Register, Church Records, and Epitaphs of Lancaster, which was published in 1890, and I'm sure is still used heavily by genealogists all the time, and wrote a number of shorter historical pieces as well. Nourse's great familiarity with manuscript sources, excuse me for a minute, the fall cold is setting in now, were apparent in these works and led directly to an invitation to write the official history of Harvard, one of Lancaster's daughter towns, which he accepted. His history of the town of Harvard appeared in 1894. Henry Nourse was a member of the Massachusetts Historical Society, the Massachusetts Military Historical Society, and the American Antiquarian Society. He wrote historical pieces for the Clinton Courant. He was a serious collector of Lancaster-related documentation and artifacts and an inveterate compiler of scrapbooks incorporating historical materials. These scrapbooks became part of the Thayer Memorial Library's Lancaster collection, which Nourse was instrumental in founding and for which he left an endowment in his will. Unlike Nourse, Abijah Perkins Marvin was not a Lancaster native. Descended from 17th century Connecticut settlers, he was born in Lyme in 1813, which made him close to a generation older than Nourse. He died in Lancaster in 1889. Marvin attended public school in Lyme. At the age of 14, he took a job in a printing office, remaining in that line of work for 6 years before pursuing higher education. He prepared for college in Brattleboro, Vermont, and then attended Washington College, which is now Trinity College, in Hartford, Connecticut, and graduated in 1839. Marvin, too, taught school before settling into his true calling. He taught public school in Delaware prior to entering college, and private school in Virginia in 1840 and 1841. These experiences fueled an antipathy to Southern slavery. Marvin returned to New England in 1841, studied theology, and was ordained minister of the Congregational Church in Winchendon, Massachusetts, in January 1844. He held that position until 1866. He then served as an agent for the American Congregational Association and the associate editor of the Boston Recorder, a denominational newspaper. In 1870, following the resignation of George Leavitt as the congregational minister in Lancaster, Abijah Marvin became acting pastor at the Evangelical Congregational Church. In 1872, he became pastor of the church, serving in that capacity till 1875. And he remained a Lancaster resident after leaving his pastorship. Marvin's interest in local history predated his residence here and was not focused entirely on Lancaster. He prepared a town history of Winchendon, which appeared in 1868. His history of Worcester in the War of the Rebellion was published in 1870, 9 years before his history of the town of Lancaster. He also wrote a number of histories for a 2-volume history of Worcester County, published in 1879. The sections on Worcester County as an administrative unit, or administrative whole, and on the histories of Ashburnham, Berlin, Bolton, Brookfield, Hardwick, Harvard, Lancaster, Leicester, Northbridge, Southbridge, Sterling, and Winchendon were all his work. At his death in 1889, he left a manuscript Life of Cotton Mather, which was published in 1892. Marvin was a member of the New England Historic Genealogical Society. So from these few facts, it's clear that while Nourse and Marvin were not what we would consider professional historians nowadays, both had significant experience in historical research and writing, and both were held in sufficiently high esteem by their contemporaries to be asked to share their expertise. But if you read Nourse's annotations in his extra illustrated copy of Marvin's History of Lancaster, you might come away with the impression that Marvin was not much of a historian. Let me provide a few examples. In annotating a passage on page 8 of the printed text in the first volume of the extra illustrated set, in which Marvin emphasizes the importance to local history of archival materials at the State House, Nourse comments, "A very singular fact is that the author seems not to have visited the probate officer or registry of deeds of Middlesex County. He does not mention them, nor is there any internal evidence in his work showing that he ever delved in the stores of information there. Yet there, free for examination, are many wills and inventories of estates and copies of the deeds of Lancaster's first settlers. Had he but briefly studied these, he could not have made such glaring mistakes in locating the homes of the early proprietors." Ouch, that's harsh. Further along, written directly on page 66 of the printed text, Nourse responds sharply to Marvin's assertions about some of Lancaster's earlier roads. Guesswork entirely uncalled for and based upon false assumptions. In reaction to Marvin's account on page 108 of Mr. Rowlandson, Captain Curley, and Mr. Drew, all brothers-in-law, returning from Boston in February 1676 to find the town devastated by King Philip's warriors, Nourse writes, "Was there a Mr. Drew? I can discover none." In regard to Marvin's quoting a passage from the town records to place one of Lancaster's 18th century schoolhouses in the North Village on page 212 of the printed text, Nourse observes on a blank sheet bound into the volume, "Here the historian has left out 'on the neck' important words proving that he is merely indulging his fervid imagination in locating this schoolhouse at the North Village." Countering Marvin's report on pages 257 and 258 of Lancaster's military record in the French and Indian War, Nourse writes, "Here is a knot of blunders," and then goes on to list in great detail the 5 reasons why that's so. Nourse's commentary in volumes 2 and 3 continue in the same vein. In volume 2, regarding Marvin's dating of the breaking up of the plantation of Lower Ashuelot, New Hampshire, where the Reverend Timothy Harrington was minister before coming to Lancaster, Nourse corrects the words, "the spring of 1747" to April 13th, 1747, and writes peevishly on an inserted blank page, "It sometimes almost seems as though the author prefers a loose statement of a fact, even when the exact date is accessible and more brief than the expression chosen." Objecting to Marvin's incorrect location of the Union Turnpike, Nourse declares on an added blank page, "Mr. Marvin here evidently does not know where the Union Turnpike was. The Union Turnpike joined the Concord Pike with Leominster, running through the central part of Harvard. It is in the northern part of the town. The Bolton and Lancaster Turnpike, about which Mr. M. here comments, is a very different affair." He describes the Union Turnpike on page 403 without knowing its proper title, apparently. In volume 3, Nourse proclaims one passage axiomatic twaddle, pronounces another mere conjecture, writes of another not so, reacts to yet another with bosh. I mean, how long has it been since anybody used that word, right? He also mocks Marvin's sentimentality in describing the gravestones of 7 children of Dr. Stanton Prentice and his wife on page 646. Since volume 4 consists entirely of transcriptions and other materials selected by Nourse to round out Marvin's history, It didn't provide the same opportunity for retort found in the 3 volumes containing Marvin's printed text. But this is enough, I think, to raise the question of why Nourse approached Marvin as the historian of Lancaster with such seeming animus. Were Marvin's faults as a historian really as egregious as Nourse found them? Having worked in local history for decades, I'm acutely conscious that all printed and electronic sources, even the ones that we use all the time and the ones that we trust, contain errors of fact and of omission. Error is just about inevitable in the writing of history, and capable historians know this. Yet Nourse was relentless in pointing out Marvin's shortcomings. In preparing for this talk, I would love to have located a secret cache of Henry Stedman Nourse correspondence, or perhaps a diary. Such items may be out there somewhere. I wasn't able to find them. If anybody has secret knowledge of where they might be, I'd love to know about it, and please share with me afterwards. Even if Nourse letters or diaries turned up, though, I'm not sure that they would offer deeper insight into what motivated Nourse's response to Marvin than can be deduced from evidence within the extra illustrated set itself, along with a few printed sources. As an aside, it's interesting to note that there's so little supporting documentation about the creation of most extra illustrated books. There are exceptions. One for which excellent documentation exists is a set in the Concord Free Public Library Special Collections. Alfred Hosmer's extra illustrated copy of the 1896 second edition of Henry Salt's biography of Thoreau. An extensive body survives between Hosmer and several other early Thoreauvians in the mid to late 1890s, and it tells the story about this extra illustration project. It's everything you could want to know about the set, but that's extremely rare. So what moved Nourse to undertake his Marvin project? Above all, there's the matter of temperament. Certainly, Nourse was fierce in his insistence on accuracy. He was exacting. He was a stickler for facts and details. He made great demands of himself as well as of others in presenting history. In a memorial piece published in the Proceedings of the American Antiquarian Society for April 1904, Samuel Swett Green characterized Nourse as follows: "No man was ever more scrupulous in verifying his facts. He would go through with microscopic eye a whole edition of any of his published books, pen in hand, correcting minute errors of the press that had escaped the proofreader. He was one of the most industrious and diligent of men. You never found him idle, and seldom vacillating as to the course he had better take. This singleness of purpose was part and parcel of his integrity and probity, and it operated to exclude from his character all insincerity, pretense, and affectation. Perhaps it also excluded a degree of geniality and bonhomie from his social intercourse, and imparted at times something of austerity and even acerbity to his manner. Such a person must always be out of his element in any company where compliments and social tact are more esteemed than frank truth and sincerity. Our plain-dealing friend sometimes went towards the other extreme. If he knew a thing was true, he did not greatly concern himself as to whether it would be agreeable. The thing he said would never be unfair or unkind as it lay in his own mind or as it left his lips. But he lacked something of the sympathetic imagination that should anticipate in word or tone and realize how it will strike the other party. So I have no intention today of broaching the subject of whether or not Abijah Marvin was, from an objective point of view, a good historian. I'm not touching that one with a 10-foot pole. As I said earlier, his history of Lancaster is still serviceable, whatever its imperfections may be. In his introduction to the history, Marvin himself emphasized that he had relied on original sources in transcribing documents rather than on later transcripts in manuscript or print. So he at least understood that that was the standard to which a historian should attain. But given the dozens and dozens of corrections Nourse made to faulty transcriptions that Marvin apparently copied verbatim, errors and all, from sources other than the original, and his numerous references to sources that Marvin did not consult, It's fair to say that Marvin adhered to less exacting standards of research and documentation than Nourse. Because Nourse cared so deeply about the history of Lancaster and about getting things right, Marvin's more relaxed approach aggrieved him. Henry Stedman Nourse had sound historical judgment, and he wasn't the only one among his contemporaries who was underwhelmed by Marvin's historical prowess. Charles Hudson, another local historian who wrote town histories of Westminster, Marlborough, and Lexington, and for whom the town of Hudson, Massachusetts was named, penned an article titled "How to Write Town Histories" for the New England Historical and Genealogical Register for 1880. Hudson emphasized the importance of linking local events to broader history. He was distressed by the undiscriminating and myopic focus of some town historians on small details, sometimes at the expense of the threads connecting local to national. Interestingly, Lancaster's recently published town history was one of 3 examples he specifically cited as guilty of this defect. Hudson wrote, "Lancaster was one of the earliest and most important towns in the Commonwealth, and in fact has furnished more incidents for public history than almost any town in the state. Here the annals of the town on every page seem to afford materials for public history and to suggest reflections bearing upon the welfare of the whole country. The settlement in the midst of Indian tribes might afford matter for serious reflection and give an insight to the Indian character. The depredations in Philip's War would seem forcibly to suggest the cause of that war, the character of the chief who instituted it, the vigor with which he prosecuted it, the number of towns which were wholly or partially destroyed, and the great suffering of the colonies and the final capture of that bloody warrior. And the subsequent incursions of the savages," that's a word we don't use anymore, but this was the late 19th century, of the savages under the guidance or with the approbation of the French, would seem to present the inquiry, what led to these prolonged contests between England and France for these northern and western possessions? And this inquiry would very naturally reveal the fact that the religious element, as well as the territorial, was involved in the contest. But we were disappointed to see that these subjects were either omitted or touched upon so briefly as to deprive the good old town of Lancaster of the honor of being a constituent part of the community, suffering for others more remote from the scene of danger, but equally interested in the great questions at issue. It would seem also that a biographical sketch of some of the actors in these wars and of some of the brave men who came to the relief of Lancaster in the days of her peril were quite as important and would be quite as interesting even to the people of the place as the names of obscure persons found upon some of the dilapidated stones in the ancient graveyards, or the location of some private road. The settlement of the first ministers, when there was but one in town and he settled for life, and in most such cases was the sole educated man in the town, might properly be stated in detail. But when the people became divided into several religious societies and their clergymen were frequently changing, it would seem that the details of the councils to settle or dismiss the minister, even to the locality and name of the delegates, would belong rather to the records of each society than to the history of the town. This is strong stuff, considering that it appeared in print in a respectable and readily accessible periodical. We know that Nourse was aware of Hudson's article because he referred to it, approvingly of course, in one of his annotations. Moreover, there was some reserve bordering on ambivalence in the prefatory note included by Lancaster's Committee of Publication at the beginning of Marvin's history. Following a pro forma, all credit goes to the author kind of statement, the committee declared, "The committee do not hold themselves responsible for any statements of opinion which he," meaning Marvin, "has made, nor either in general or in detail for the manner in which he has executed his task." Although the committee, which to be fair included Marvin himself, expressed satisfaction in the author's having discharged his obligations to the town with ability and fidelity, this seems somehow less than a resounding endorsement. In its prefatory note, the committee also divulged that although there were natives of the town who were competent to write its history, yet their engagements would have prevented. This suggests that Marvin was not necessarily the committee's first choice of author. Did the committee consider Henry Stedman Nourse, who was born and raised in Lancaster, as one of those competent others? Did they ask Nourse before turning to Marvin? And might that have affected Nourse's receptiveness to Marvin's work? We don't know for sure, but it's possible. From our standpoint, Marvin's not being a native Lancastrian might not seem like that big a deal. Mobility is a part of modern life, and many, if not most, of the people we know in our hometowns, these days anyway, come from somewhere else. But in 19th century New England, being from a place really mattered. The people of a town instinctively trusted the expertise of a native more than that of a relative newcomer. This local partiality manifested itself in Concord, too, in Edward Jarvis's extra illustrated copy of Shattuck's 1835 History of Concord. Shattuck was born in Ashby, Jarvis in Concord, and Jarvis was critical of a rival whose knowledge of Concord was not bred in the bone. Also, the fact that Marvin's research interests encompassed many more towns in Worcester County than Lancaster may have contributed to some doubt about the depth of his commitment to this place specifically. All of this gets, of course, to the question of the ownership of local history. Who's worthy to interpret it? Who's the most trustworthy expert? Someone local as opposed to an outsider? A professional historian as opposed to a resident enthusiast who knows the past anecdotally? You might think that we've gotten past these kinds of questions, but we really haven't. You spend a little time in Concord where there are more separate historical agencies within the boundaries of the town than seems physically possible, each one claiming some degree of authority higher than the rest, and you'll understand that the competitive tension among local historians is indeed still alive. It simply reflects human nature. Finally, Nourse's service in the Civil War and Marvin's lack of that defining experience may also have colored Nourse's perspective on Marvin's history. Nourse participated in active fighting, while Marvin wrote his chapter on Lancaster in the War of the Rebellion without that advantage. To be sure, as an anti-slavery sympathizer, he embraced the Union cause. But holding principled beliefs does not command the same respect as putting your life on the line. In Volume 3 of his extra illustrated Marvin, Nourse allowed his pique at Marvin's ignorance of military life to show through in his annotations. Regarding a passage in which Marvin enumerated bed ticks, that is mattresses, among the items needed by soldiers, Nourse exclaimed, "Bed ticks in the field, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point." In response to Marvin's statement that the 15th Regiment was reduced to a platoon in the wilderness in the spring of 1864, he wrote, "Does the author know what a platoon is?" Nourse detected and disdained inauthenticity in Marvin regarding involvement that he, Nourse, had lived firsthand. And if Marvin was on shaky ground in covering what was then practically still current event, why should Nourse or anyone else have trusted him on the history of the 17th and 18th centuries, which nobody could remember personally? So you may feel that there was some unkindness in Nourse's frankness about Marvin's failures, but I don't think that he actually intended to publicly embarrass Marvin. While under construction, Nourse's extra illustrated Marvin was a private record. It started out as a performance without an audience, acquiring an audience, or at least a potential audience, only after it came to the public library here in Lancaster. Because Marvin could have seen it only if Nourse allowed him to, it's unlikely that he had the chance. And as far as I can tell, Nourse was moved by pride and principle, not by ill will. Significantly, the accession records at the library seem to indicate that the 4 volumes of Nourse's Marvin came here not from Nourse himself, but rather through his wife's son by her first husband, George Thurston. Did Nourse and Marvin know one another? They must have. According to the state census of 1875, Lancaster's population was then just under 2,000 people. In a town of that size, what are the chances that two prominent residents, each with an interest in local history, would not at least cross paths sometimes, perhaps right here in the library? But whatever direct connection they might have had, positive, negative, or lukewarm, I don't get a sense from the tenor and content of Nourse's annotations that personal relations played a major role in his response to Marvin's history. So before we look at the history close up and personal, what can we say in conclusion about these simultaneously fascinating and idiosyncratic 4 volumes? Improving upon Marvin's printed text was probably cathartic for Nourse in some way, but do his efforts in this have relevance or usefulness for us now? I think it's evident that Nourse's extra illustrated Marvin has value in enhancing the historical record as Marvin established it. Serious students of Lancaster history will benefit from the comparison and evaluation of information that it encourages. And now that anyone, anywhere can access it anytime on ThayerMemorialLibrary.org, it's a resource that you don't need to leave home to consult. Nourse would be amazed, and I'm pretty sure he would be chagrined as well, to realize how completely accessible his addenda to Marvin have become. More broadly speaking, Nourse's Marvin also reminds us of the collective and evolving nature of historical research and writing. History is practiced by subjective human beings. Information is filtered through the human mind, which makes complete objectivity near impossible. Definitely impossible, not just near impossible, regardless of the quantity and quality of data taken into consideration. New interpretations blossom as new data and new social and cultural values enter the picture, and when historians construct, defend, and discuss varying versions of historical reality. Disagreement and exchange, along with the grounding of fresh efforts in earlier work, make history a collective effort, even when practiced by solitary individuals. I don't think there's any doubt that Henry Stedman Nourse was irked that somebody else got to write Lancaster's official history. And his extra illustrated Marvin was, on one level, an attempt to have the last word. But in adding directly to Abijah Marvin's work, he also recognized, however grudgingly, and it was grudging for sure, that the practice of history is more a dialogue than a soliloquy. The notion of a historical last word is simply an illusion, and Nourse was a serious enough historian to understand that, pride notwithstanding. So that's the formal part of the program. For the rest of the program, I would ask you all to come up, and we're going to look at some of the things that I've marked in the 4 volumes so that you can get a better feeling for what it is that Nourse was doing. And honestly, this is something that I could have done as a slideshow, a PowerPoint slideshow, but I really think that there's something very powerful about seeing the 4 volumes themselves and really getting a feeling for what it was that Nourse was doing. So come on up if you still have the stomach for Nourse and Marvin. So I have the first 2 volumes open here. This first one is open to that note on page 8, written directly on the printed page. And this is the snarky comment about Marvin not being aware of the resources that are available in the Middlesex Registry of Deeds. And so that's a major part of what he's doing in this set. He's reacting very specifically to passages in the text. And now it's definitely evidence of engagement with reading. It may not be positive engagement with reading, but it's evidence of engagement. Okay. So this is in relation to passages describing the early houses. Come on in. Describing the early houses of Lancaster. And Nourse has gone, and these are not necessarily Lancaster houses. There's 3 pages of these sketches, but he's given drawings of colonial houses so that people can understand what it is that's being referred to in the text. And so you can see there's multiple pages that have to do with that. All right, and then this one. This is a gorgeous photograph that's been added. And not only that, can you read what it says down on the bottom there? No, it's not. It's 18, right, so it says 1890. So we know that he was still working on this set in 1890 because of some of the annotations.
Another picture of it, and if you look across, there were no trees
Right,
between
yeah.
Langen Road and
Yeah,
this road.
yeah.
And it is just a little bit, if you see look across, you can see the spire of the Evangelical Congregational
Yeah,
Church.
yeah,
And
yeah,
it's just a little bit further to the north
Yeah.
of that.
yeah.
So that gives us a bearing, and Marcia Jacobowitz has the rods.
Okay, that's
The
great.
rod measurement.
Well, I figured that if I didn't find out where it was, somebody was going to ask me today, so I needed to.
Marcia will find out
Yeah.
next week.
Okay, that's great. But I mean, photographs are wonderful, and in some ways they're among the most valuable things in the whole set. Here's a map that Nourse has traced out of I think a printed source. It's a map of the Nipmuc country, and it comes from a source by Samuel Drake. So you can see the places where Native Americans were present. And here we have, let's see. Oh, this is a great section here. So you can see how he's added some pages of notes, and these particular notes have to do with with local place names. That's something that sometimes is very hard to find information about. And once again, Marvin didn't tell us why George Hill was called George Hill, so Nourse felt compelled to tell us that, and other things as well. Yeah, yeah. And then we have, let's see, what do we have? This is, you can see that Marvin has been transcribing a 17th century document, and Nourse just can't keep his hands off the mistakes. He has to correct every mistake that he sees. I mean, as that quote that I read about him, he did it in his own work as well, but he definitely wasn't going to let, Marvin get away. Yes, sure. Ask questions as many as you like. Yeah. I guess I picture it being a pen that's got a steel point and that's dipped in ink, but once again, I don't know for sure. Yeah.
It's very neat handwriting.
It is very neat handwriting. And this is, let's see, oh yeah, this is another map. This is a fold-out map, I think. Let's see, what do we have here? What is this one? I'm upside down, so I can't see what I'm looking at. Oh, yeah, so this is a map of the locations of the early settlers, and he takes great pains to say in the caption that this is radically different from what Mr. Marvin drew.